the dying days of America's gangster era, one man outsmarted them all. The cops, the feds, even J. Edgar Hoover himself. He wasn't loud or reckless like Dillinger. He was quiet, calculating, and utterly ruthless. His name was Alvin Karpis, the last man to ever wear the title Public Enemy #1. But how does a boy from the shadows rise to become the final outlaw of the golden age of crime? And why did it all end with a single knock on his door? If you love stories of ambition, betrayal, and the dark side of American history, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because more tales from the underworld are coming your way. The story of Alvin Karpis doesn't begin with gunfire or getaway cars. It begins in the quiet desperation of a family that never had much to lose. Born Alvin Francis Karpowicz in Montreal, Canada in 1907, he came into a world that had already decided his worth. His parents were poor Lithuanian immigrants, tired from work, worn by life, and too busy surviving to notice the hunger for something darker growing inside their son. When Alvin was still a boy, the family moved to Topeka, Kansas, a place that promised stability but delivered monotony. The fields stretched endlessly, the trains howled through the night, and the boy who would one day become Public Enemy #1 spent his youth watching the world roll by without him. It was the 1910s, an age of bootstraps and broken dreams. For a restless kid like Alvin, the smell of dust and diesel felt like a cage. He was quiet, calculating, not the kind of boy to pick a fight, but the kind who learned quickly how to disappear when trouble came. People said he had a stare that could make you nervous, not wild, not angry, but cold. It was the kind of look that said he was watching, learning, waiting. By his early teens, Karpis wasn't just waiting anymore. He started stealing. Small things at first, a loaf of bread, a few coins from a cash register, a pocket knife left on a porch. He learned that the world didn't notice when the poor took from the rich, and if it did, it didn't care enough to stop them. There was no remorse, no second thoughts, just survival. Then came the railroads. For boys like Karpis, the trains were both freedom and temptation. He rode the freights across Kansas and Oklahoma, sleeping under bridges, scamming travelers, learning from the drifters and the drunks. Somewhere along those dusty rails, the line between right and wrong stopped mattering. The law wasn't protection, it was an obstacle. By the age of 15, he was already known to local authorities as a thief and a troublemaker. Reform school followed, then prison, but punishment didn't fix him, it refined him. Inside those walls, Alvin learned the trade of crime from the best teachers you could ask for, convicts. He studied their tricks, their silence, their cold logic. Where others saw prison as hell, Karpis saw a university. He learned how to plan, how to keep his mouth shut, how to look at every situation like a chessboard. Every move mattered. Every mistake could mean death. When he got out, he didn't go home. There was nothing left for him there. Instead, he drifted south into the underworld of the 1920s, a time when America's heartland was turning lawless. Prohibition had created a booming black market, and gangsters were no longer just criminals. They were businessmen, celebrities, even heroes to some. In Tulsa, Karpis found his footing. The oil boom had made men rich overnight, and greed was thick in the air. He ran small cons, teamed up with petty crooks, and worked his way into bootlegging. Money came fast, and so did violence. But what made Alvin different wasn't his aim or his nerve, it was his patience. He wasn't reckless like most of the young guns. He planned, watched, waited for the perfect moment. He'd say later that most crooks go off half-cocked and wind up dead. He preferred to walk out alive. That attitude caught the attention of other criminals. One in particular would change his life forever, Freddie Barker. The Barkers were a family of outlaws, raised in the hard edges of the Depression, running jobs across the Midwest. Freddie was charming but impulsive. Alvin was the opposite. Together they were a dangerous mix, brains and bravado. By the early 1930s, the two had become inseparable, robbing banks, hijacking shipments, and making headlines from Kansas to Minnesota. But the newspapers didn't just write about them, they sensationalized them. And in the shadows, a legend began to form. Still, in those early days, Alvin wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing control. He'd seen too many men die from bad planning or loyalty to the wrong people. He wasn't sentimental, and he didn't believe in honor among thieves. What he believed in was survival, And maybe that's what set him apart from others like Dillinger or Pretty Boy Floyd. They wanted to be icons. Alvin Karpis wanted to live. He saw through the glamour of crime, the shiny suits, the cars, the crowds that cheered bank robbers like movie stars. He knew that every applause was temporary, every deal fragile. Even as a young man, he carried himself with the caution of someone who understood that every decision would come with a cost. There's a story that in one of his early robberies, when a job went south and bullets started flying, Freddie Barker panicked. Alvin didn't. He calmly walked to the getaway car, started the engine, and waited for his partner to catch up. That was Karpis in a nutshell. Cold, methodical, never rushing even when death was at his door. But even calm men have ghosts. The more he stole, the more he realized the world he was entering had no exit signs. Every score meant new enemies, and every friend could be a liability. The law was closing in, and the underworld was full of double-crossers. Somewhere between the dusty roads of Kansas and the neon lights of St. Paul, Alvin stopped being a small-time crook. He became something else, something the newspapers would later call a criminal mastermind. But behind that title was still the same, boy from Topeka, the one who'd learned that the world doesn't give you anything unless you take it. As the Great Depression deepened, crime became an industry. The Barker Gang, with Alvin's leadership and precision, would soon become one of the most feared criminal groups in America. They'd rob banks, kidnap millionaires, and stay one step ahead of J. Edgar Hoover's newly empowered FBI. And through it all, Alvin remained the same, quiet, observant, and unshakably calm. The kind of calm that doesn't come from peace, but from knowing there's no turning back. In the eyes of the world, he was a villain. In his own eyes, he was just doing what he'd always done, surviving in a world that never gave him a chance. The legend of Alvin Karpis, the last public enemy, was only beginning to take shape. And in the smoke-filled bars and blood-stained alleys of Depression-era America, whispers of his name began to spread. They said he was smart, too smart. They said he could plan a job down to the second, and that no one, not even Hoover himself, could outthink him. But every rise has its fall. And for Alvin Karpis, the road to infamy had only just begun. When the 1930s rolled in, America was on its knees. The Great Depression had stolen jobs, homes, and hope. Banks were the new villains in the public's eyes, and every headline about a daring robbery read like a twisted kind of revenge. It was the perfect stage for outlaws like Alvin Karpis to become something bigger than criminals. They became symbols of rebellion in a world that had turned cold and unfair. By then, Alvin had already shed his old life like a snake's skin. He wasn't the drifting boy from Kansas anymore. He was a man with a purpose and a reputation. The streets whispered his name, and among those whispers, one name came up more than any other: the Barkers. The Barker family had been running jobs across the Midwest for years. There was Herman, who was wild and unpredictable, Lloyd, a bit more disciplined but reckless, and Freddie, Alvin's closest friend and partner in crime. But the real power behind them wasn't any of the brothers. It was their mother, Kate "Ma" Barker. Now history has painted Ma Barker as the criminal matriarch who led her sons into a life of crime. Some say she was the mastermind, others say she was just a mother who loved her boys too much to stop them. But to Alvin, she was something else entirely, a steady hand in a world full of chaos. He respected her calmness, her loyalty, and the way she always had a place for him at the table. When he joined forces with the Barkers, it wasn't just about money, it was about family, the one thing he'd never truly had. Their early jobs were quick and brutal. They robbed small-town banks, gas stations, and payroll trucks. Alvin's careful planning matched perfectly with Freddie's bold execution. He'd draw the blueprints, time the guards' shifts, and even calculate how long it would take for the police to respond. The Barkers had muscle, but Karpis gave them brains. They were fast becoming legends, part myth, part menace. Newspapers called them the Bloody Barkers, and every heist added fuel to the fire. People in the Midwest whispered that the gang could vanish like ghosts. Alvin encouraged that myth. Fear, he knew, was as valuable as firepower. Their operations spread from Kansas to Oklahoma, Missouri, and Minnesota. The gang hid in safe houses, rented under fake names, and relied on corrupt lawmen who looked the other way for a price. St. Paul, Minnesota, became their favorite hideout, a city where criminals were practically untouchable if they paid off the right cops. It was there, in the dim corners of speakeasies and smoky hotel rooms, that Alvin began to evolve into something more than a crook. He became a strategist. While others lived for the thrill, he lived for the precision of it all, the careful timing, the flawless getaway, the way every moving part came together like clockwork. But power brings attention, and attention brings trouble. The Barker-Karpis gang didn't just make enemies among the law, they made them among other criminals. Rival gangs tried to cut into their territories, informants sold secrets, and shootouts became a regular part of business. One of their most notorious acts came in 1933, the kidnapping of William Ham, the wealthy president of Ham's Brewery in St. Paul. Alvin planned it down to the minute. Ham was grabbed on the street, driven across state lines, and held in a safe house until his family paid a ransom of $100,000. A fortune in those days. The job went off perfectly, and no one got hurt. Alvin saw it as a clean business transaction, but to the FBI it was a declaration of war. Kidnapping was federal territory, and J. Edgar Hoover wasn't about to let anyone make the Bureau look weak. The Barker-Karpis gang became the FBI's prime target. Their photos were pinned to office walls, their names circled in red ink, and their movements tracked by agents across the country. Still, Alvin stayed calm. He switched hideouts, changed cars, burned evidence, and made sure no one could trace them. But the money and the power had changed things. Freddie Barker had become bolder, Ma Barker more protective, and the younger members of the gang hungered for notoriety. Alvin knew that fame was a death sentence in their line of work, but by then it was too late. The legend had already taken on a life of its own. In 1934, the gang pulled off another high-profile kidnapping, Edward Bremer, a wealthy banker's son. The ransom was enormous, over $200,000. It was a success, but it brought the full fury of Hoover's FBI crashing down on them. The Bureau now had public backing, new laws, and a personal vendetta. Alvin's name was added to the official public enemy list, right alongside John Dillinger, Babyface Nelson, and Pretty Boy Floyd. But while those men were loud, brash and flashy, Alvin was something else. He was methodical, deliberate, and unshakably calm under pressure. Hoover himself would later admit that Karpis was superior in intelligence to any other criminal he'd faced. Still, even the smartest outlaw can't control everyone around him. Freddie's recklessness grew worse. He spent money carelessly, took unnecessary risks, and ignored Alvin's warnings. And Ma, once the gang's quiet anchor, started drawing more attention just by being around. Hoover's men were closing in, and one mistake could bring everything crashing down. Yet in those dark years, Alvin thrived. The chaos around him only made him sharper. He built connections, stashed money, and prepared for the day the heat would be too much. He wasn't like Dillinger, who died in a blaze of gunfire outside a theater. Alvin didn't crave the spotlight. He craved control. To those who worked with him, he was both feared and respected. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply looked at you with those cold, calculating eyes and told you what was going to happen. And more often than not, it happened exactly that way. The Barker-Karpis gang was now at its peak, rich, infamous, and wanted by every lawman in America. But Alvin knew better than anyone that the higher you climb, the thinner the air gets. Behind the scenes, cracks were forming. The gang's hideouts were being discovered. Informants were flipping. Safe contacts were vanishing. Hoover's men were relentless, armed with new technology, wiretaps, and the full power of federal law. Alvin tried to hold things together, but the tide was turning. Each robbery, each kidnapping, each close call, it all added up to one thing: time running out. Still, for a while, they managed to stay ahead. They moved from town to town, sometimes just hours before the FBI arrived. Alvin's discipline kept them alive longer than anyone expected, but deep down, he knew this couldn't last. He'd built an empire in the cracks of a collapsing world, and now the cracks were closing. The gang was burning hot and bright, but like all flames, it would soon consume itself. And when it did, Alvin Karpis would be left standing alone. Public enemy number one, the last outlaw in a dying age. The Barker-Karpis gang's empire reached its height in the mid-1930s, a time when the country was still clawing its way out of the Great Depression, and every headline of a daring bank robbery seemed to echo the people's quiet hatred for the institutions that had failed them. Alvin Karpis understood that resentment. He used it like a weapon. To some, he was a criminal genius. To others, he was a symbol of rebellion in a broken world. But behind the glamorized headlines and whispered praise, Alvin saw the truth. They were living on borrowed time. The money was good, yes. Safe houses were filled with stacks of bills, polished guns, and stolen liquor. They had cars faster than the law, safe routes through the countryside, and a network of contacts stretching from St. Paul to New Orleans. But with every dollar came a new risk. Every move drew the gaze of the Bureau closer. Still, for a while, it all worked like clockwork. Alvin's discipline kept the gang from self-destruction. He ran their operations like a business, cold, efficient, without emotion. He banned unnecessary violence, discouraged drinking on jobs, and demanded that everyone stick to the plan. When he spoke, the others listened. Even Freddie Barker, reckless as he was, respected Alvin's authority. Their robberies became more daring, their kidnappings more profitable. They'd perfected the art of invisibility, moving through cities under fake names, staying in cheap motels, blending in with the everyday crowd. Alvin had an uncanny ability to read people, to sense when someone was nervous or lying. He'd sit quietly in a diner, sipping coffee, scanning the room with those sharp eyes, memorizing faces and exits. It was that instinct that kept them alive when most gangs were already buried. But the more successful they became, the more tension brewed beneath the surface. Money has a way of corroding trust. Some members started grumbling about shares, others about leadership. Alvin could feel it, the unease creeping in like rot. He knew too well what happened when loyalty started to fade. He tried to keep order, but the Barker family was a wild thing, bound more by blood than logic. Freddie especially was getting reckless, throwing lavish parties, bragging in public, attracting attention. Alvin warned him, but Freddie laughed it off. "We're ghosts, Al," he said once, his grin too wide, his drink half spilled. "They can't catch what they can't see." Alvin didn't laugh. He'd seen too many ghosts end up face down in the dirt. Meanwhile, the FBI was tightening its grip. Edgar Hoover had turned the Bureau into a machine of obsession. He needed a win. Dillinger was dead, Pretty Boy Floyd was gone, Babyface Nelson had been shot to pieces. Only one name remained at the top of the public enemies list: Alvin Karpis. The last public enemy. Hoover made it personal. Agents were sent to every known associate, every rumored hideout. Wiretaps, informants, bribes, nothing was off limits. The Barker-Karpis gang was being hunted like wolves, but Alvin didn't run. Not yet. He moved strategically, splitting the gang into smaller groups, setting up hideouts in remote cabins across the Midwest. He changed cars constantly, burned maps after every job, and carried multiple identities. To him, the chase was just another game, one he fully intended to win. Still, cracks were showing. In 1935, disaster struck. The FBI tracked down Ma and Freddie Barker to a lakefront hideout in Ocklawaha, Florida. The place was surrounded at dawn. What followed was a gunfight that lasted hours, bullets ripping through walls, windows shattering, smoke filling the air. When the shooting stopped, the Barkers were dead. Freddie with his gun still warm, Ma with her son's body cradled against her. The Bureau claimed she'd fired back. Alvin never believed it. Ma couldn't shoot a fly, he'd later say. She just wanted to protect her boy. The news hit him harder than he expected. The Barker gang, as the world knew it, was gone. But Alvin, cold, careful Alvin, didn't crumble. He went silent, disappeared into the background, and kept moving. Alone now, but more dangerous than ever. He formed new alliances, small crews of trusted men who owed him their lives. They robbed trains, hijacked shipments, and ran bootleg operations across the South. But something had changed. The old thrill was gone. Every job felt heavier, every night quieter. He was no longer fighting for wealth or fame. He was fighting for survival. The law was changing too. The FBI was now fully armed, better trained, and more ruthless. They had cars as fast as his, radios, that could track him, and a leader obsessed with making an example out of him. Hoover wanted a headline, and Alvin knew it. But he wasn't going to give the Bureau the satisfaction of a shootout. That wasn't his style. "Dying's easy," he once said. "Outsmarting them, that's the hard part." For a while he managed just that. He vanished from the headlines, using the chaos of the Depression to his advantage. Rumors placed him everywhere, from Mexico to Canada. But the truth was simpler. He was still in the States, living under a false name, staying 2 steps ahead. He took jobs no one expected, sometimes working alongside smaller-time crooks who didn't even realize who he was. The last public enemy, hiding in plain sight. But even legends get tired. By 1936, Alvin was worn down. Years on the run had stripped him of rest and trust. The faces around him changed too quickly, and the safe houses didn't feel safe anymore. He could sense the walls closing in. The Bureau wasn't guessing anymore. They knew. When the end finally came, it wasn't in a blaze of gunfire or a desperate escape. It was quiet, almost anticlimactic. Hoover's agents cornered him in New Orleans, May 1936. They said Hoover himself was there for the arrest, though historians still debate whether he arrived after the fact to pose for photos. Karpis was taken, alive, the only major public enemy to be captured rather than killed. That alone was a testament to his intelligence and his restraint. He didn't see surrender as defeat. To him it was simply the next move in a long, calculated game. As they led him away in handcuffs, reporters shouted questions. He said nothing. Just that same calm stare, the same quiet confidence that had carried him through every heist, every gunfight, every betrayal. He'd outlasted them all, Dillinger, Nelson, Floyd, and now he was the last one left standing. The reign of Alvin Karpis was over. But his legend, the story of the man too smart to die young, was only beginning to take root. The summer air in New Orleans was thick enough to choke on the morning Alvin Karpis was caught. The city hummed with that old southern rhythm, slow, sticky, and restless. But beneath the jazz and heat, something darker was brewing. The FBI had been waiting for this moment for years, and J. Edgar Hoover wanted it done in style. By 1936, Alvin wasn't the young outlaw who once outsmarted entire police departments. He was older, leaner, and tired. He'd spent the last 2 years drifting between safe houses, sleeping in cheap motels, and living off old connections that were fading fast. Everyone he'd trusted was either dead, imprisoned, or turned. The world that had once belonged to gangsters was now tightening under Hoover's grip. The glamorous age of outlaws was over. Bureaucracy had won. Alvin had been living quietly under an alias, posing as a businessman in the seafood trade. To his neighbors, he was polite, punctual, and forgettable. But the FBI had been watching. A tip, no one knows from whom, led them straight to him. On May 1st, 1936, Hoover himself decided to attend the arrest. He wanted to be photographed with the last public enemy, the final trophy in a long campaign of law and order. The Bureau surrounded Alvin's car as he sat behind the wheel, unaware that his past had finally caught up. There were no gunshots, no shouts, no grand finale. Just the simple click of handcuffs and a quiet man who knew when the game was over. When they told him Hoover was there, Alvin looked him in the eye and smirked. "You boys sure took your time," he said. That line would echo through history. The FBI claimed victory, Hoover posed for the cameras, and newspapers across the country printed the headline, "Public Enemy #1 Captured Alive." For the first time in years, America exhaled. The era of the Depression-era outlaw was officially dead. But for Alvin Karpis, it wasn't death. It was a new beginning of a different kind of prison. He was sentenced to life and sent to the one place built for men like him, Alcatraz. The Rock. Alcatraz was more fortress than prison, surrounded by icy waters and fog so thick it could swallow sound. It was home to the worst of the worst. Killers, mobsters, and broken men who'd tested the limits of the system and lost. Alvin, ever the observer, didn't flinch when he arrived. He'd already decided that if this was his new world, he would master it just as he had mastered every world before. Inside, he became prisoner number 325 AZ. He kept to himself, read constantly and learned how the place worked, the routines, the guards, the cracks in the rules. He even taught himself music, eventually playing in the Alcatraz band that performed for inmates on weekends. But the ghosts of the outside world followed him. He shared time on the island with legends like Al Capone, who by then had been reduced to a shell of his former self, paranoid, confused, sick from untreated syphilis. Alvin watched him shuffle through the yard, mumbling to no one, and thought about how quickly power fades. "That's what happens when you start believing your own legend," he once said later. For Alvin, prison wasn't punishment, it was observation. He studied men, systems, and silence. He rarely fought, never caused trouble, and became something of a mystery to both inmates and guards. Some respected him, others feared him. Everyone, however, knew who he was. Hoover had paraded him as a symbol of law and order's triumph, but in truth, Alvin Karpis outlasted them all. He would spend more than 25 years behind those bars, longer than any of the other public enemies. Dillinger was gone in a flash of gunfire, Nelson in a blaze of rage, Floyd in a field of bullets. Alvin endured. Time has a strange way of softening even the hardest edges. The years wore on, and Karpis aged into quiet contemplation. He began to write, documenting the rise and fall of the outlaw era from his unique vantage point. His memoirs, later smuggled out and published, painted a different picture than the FBI's clean narrative. He didn't glorify crime, but he didn't romanticize law enforcement either. To him, both sides were playing the same dirty game, just under different names. In 1962, after more than 2 decades, he was transferred from Alcatraz shortly before the prison was closed. He'd seen men escape and die, guards crack under pressure, and the very institution that once seemed invincible crumble into decay. The world outside had changed beyond recognition. When he was finally paroled in 1969, he was 61 years old. America was a different country now, louder, freer, but still chasing shadows. The world no longer had room for men like Alvin Karpis. The newspapers barely noticed his release. The name that once struck fear across the Midwest was now a fading echo in the halls of history. He settled quietly in Canada for a time, then moved to Spain. He kept a low profile, lived modestly, and continued to write. The years behind bars had given him clarity, and with that came a strange kind of peace. He no longer needed the thrill of danger or the satisfaction of outsmarting the law. He'd won his greatest victory simply by surviving. But even in peace, the past never really sleeps. Alvin's letters hinted at regret. Regret not for the crimes themselves, but for the wasted potential, the friends buried too young, the years lost to survival. "We were just kids," he wrote once. "The world made us wolves and then called us monsters." In 1979, Alvin Karpis was found dead in his apartment in Spain. The official cause was suicide, though some believed he simply drifted off and never woke up. No gunfire, no chase, no headlines, just silence. For the man who'd lived through so much noise, maybe that was the ending he'd wanted. The fall of Alvin Karpis wasn't like the rest. It wasn't a bullet or betrayal that ended him, it was time itself. He'd seen the rise and fall of an era, watched the myth of the gangster dissolve into history, and lived long enough to see himself become a ghost story. The world remembered the others, the charming Dillinger, the reckless Nelson, the fierce Floyd, but Alvin. He slipped quietly through the cracks, like he always had. Even Hoover, the man who built his fame on catching him, was long gone by then. History had moved on, but in the quiet corners of old photographs and yellowed FBI files, his cold stare still lingers, a reminder of a time when one man could outthink the entire system and walk away alive. For Alvin Karpis, the game had ended not in defeat, but in endurance. He was, until his last breath, exactly what the papers once called him, the last public enemy. There's something haunting about the silence that follows a legend's fall. When Alvin Karpis died in his small apartment in Torremolinos, Spain in 1979, the world barely noticed. There were no headlines, no commemorative specials, no grand retellings of his life. The man who once topped the FBI's list of America's most wanted criminals faded out quietly, like smoke from a candle that burned too long. But that's how Karpis would have wanted it. He had outlived everyone who ever hunted, betrayed, or admired him. He had become the last living ghost of an age when men robbed banks not for greed, but because they believed the system had robbed them first. To understand Alvin's legacy, you have to look past the myth. The newspapers painted him as a cold-blooded outlaw, a mastermind who used others to do his bidding. The FBI called him a dangerous genius, an enemy of order. But the truth, buried beneath the years, is more complicated. Alvin Karpis wasn't born evil. He was born poor, invisible, and hungry in a world that didn't offer second chances. He wasn't charming like Dillinger, nor wild like Nelson, nor poetic like Clyde Barrow. He was quiet, calculated. He believed in control, not chaos. If the others were fireworks, Alvin was a slow-burning fuse. In his later years, he often said he never enjoyed killing. He didn't crave blood or vengeance. He simply saw violence as a tool, one to be used sparingly and only when necessary. To him, crime was a system of logic, a business. And in a twisted way, that's what made him so dangerous. He once wrote, "A gun's a poor substitute for brains." It was a line that summed him up perfectly. He thrived on outsmarting others, police, rival gangs, even the media. Where others rushed in with guns blazing, Alvin walked in with a plan, an escape route, and a backup. That's why he survived. But survival came with a cost. Decades behind bars stripped him of the thrill, the purpose, and the noise that had once filled his life. By the time he walked free, the world had changed beyond recognition. The 1970s had no room for Depression-era outlaws. The new generation of criminals didn't rob banks. They wore suits, sat behind desks, and stole with pens instead of pistols. In interviews, Alvin sounded almost detached from the world. He didn't glorify his past, but he didn't apologize either. He spoke of his time on the run as if describing someone else's story, a movie he'd once starred in but could no longer feel. "I played the cards I was dealt," he said once, "and I didn't ask who shuffled the deck." His memoirs, Public Enemy #1 and On the Rock, became windows into a forgotten era. Readers expecting tales of glamour and adventure found instead a story soaked in loneliness, paranoia, and the hard truths of a man who'd seen too much. Alvin didn't romanticize crime. He dissected it. He wrote about fear, betrayal, and the cost of living outside the law. He also spoke candidly about Hoover and the FBI's obsession with image. In his view, the Bureau needed monsters like him to justify its power. Hoover's pursuit of fame, Alvin said, was just another hustle, different from his own, but driven by the same hunger for control. In a way, they were reflections of each other. One built his empire through law, the other through lawlessness. Both chased power, both mastered manipulation, and both understood the game better than anyone else. By the time of his death, Alvin Karpis had become more legend than man. Those who remembered him did so in whispers. Old lawmen who'd studied his files, historians fascinated by the precision of his crimes, and inmates who'd once shared the same cold concrete halls of Alcatraz. But beyond the mythology lies something more profound. Alvin's story isn't just about crime, it's about the system that made him. He came from a generation raised in desperation, boys who grew up watching their parents lose everything, who learned early that the rules were written for someone else. In that world, breaking them wasn't rebellion, it was survival. And that's the cruel irony of Alvin's legacy. He became the very thing America secretly admired and publicly condemned. He embodied both the dream of freedom and the price it demanded. Even in death, he refused to be simple. The Spanish authorities ruled his passing a suicide, but those who knew him doubted it. He wasn't the kind to quit. They said he'd been working on new writing, that he'd planned to visit Canada again, maybe even reconnect with the last fragments of family. Maybe he just slipped away, his body finally giving out after years of surviving when no one expected him to. His ashes were scattered quietly, unceremoniously. No one knows exactly where. Perhaps that's fitting for a man who spent his life in the shadows, forever moving, never belonging anywhere long enough to leave a mark. Today, his name is often left out of the big Hollywood retellings of the gangster era. The spotlight goes to Dillinger, Capone, and Bonnie and Clyde, the loud ones, the tragic ones, the romantic ones. Alvin doesn't fit their mold. He wasn't reckless enough for movies, nor charming enough for legends. He was too careful, too cold, too real. But maybe that's why his story endures for those who look deeper. Because buried beneath the outlaw headlines and FBI glory lies a man who played the longest game and won, not by beating the law, but by outlasting it. He was the last outlaw to survive the old world, and in many ways, the last one to truly understand it. When you strip away the mythology, Alvin Karpis stands as a mirror, reflecting the truth about what happens when intelligence meets desperation, when survival becomes instinct, and when a man realizes the line between justice and crime is often drawn by whoever holds the pen. He wasn't a hero, but he wasn't a monster either. He was something in between, the gray space that history rarely acknowledges but always needs. And maybe that's why, decades later, his story still whispers through time. The quiet kid from Kansas who learned to think faster than the system, the outlaw who refused to die for headlines, the man who watched the world change and simply walked out of the frame, the last public enemy, fading not in gunfire but in silence. And perhaps that silence says more about him than any shootout ever could. So if you ever find yourself looking back at the myths of America's gangster age, remember this: not every legend ends with a bang. Some simply disappear, leaving behind the kind of quiet that lingers long after the last bullet has been fired. And somewhere in that quiet, you can almost hear Alvin Karpis's voice, low, calm, certain, saying what he always knew to be true. You can beat the game if you're willing to play alone.